Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IC24 webinar series. This week, our partner is Norton Rose Fulbright, a constant partner. Vanessa Grant and I spend a lot of time together. It's always lovely to be together. And as we were musing about, okay, what are we going to talk about? This was weeks, months ago. And I said to Vanessa, the election, Trump, I think Trump had just been elected. I was like, should we talk about maybe the Canada-US dynamics? What we did not expect is that 3.5 weeks in, we would have had the turmoil, the choppy waters, the uncertainty, the signals, absence of signals, return of signals, decisions, non-decisions, and what we're navigating right now. I've been spending a lot of time talking to private equity and venture investors as to how they're preparing for this, thinking about this. And I can think of no better conversation to have, but with Vanessa and two of our colleagues. Vanessa, as I said, is the co-head of the PE practice for the firm. And then Martin Maas and Stéphane Risinger are the leaders of the cross-border trade law task force for the firm. Martin is in Ottawa and Stéphane is in Washington. And we're going to have a fulsome conversation about what they're seeing on the ground. They're both trade experts. I've known Martin for many years in previous lives. So he knows this inside out, and Stéphane has the insight on what's happening south of the border. It's very fluid, so I think they're going to talk to us about what they understand and what they see, and may ask them to make some predictions, but I know that that thinking and figuring out what's in Donald Trump's mind is a difficult thing. That being said, there's a lot of cross-border activities that happens for our investors. And that's where we're going to go today. We're going to try to figure out, as they navigate these waters, what are the core things that trade law experts are looking at and thinking about. So, Vanessa, I'm going to throw it over to you. I know we're going to do a bit of a dance, and you're going to throw it back to me, and so I'll stick around for all of it. I'm going back to my old love. So some of the members don't know I have a master's in trade policy, focused on Chapter 11 of NAFTA back in the day when that was a big controversy. And actually, Martin, we can talk about that at some point. When I was doing my master's, water was a big issue, like the investment and just how NAFTA and could have access to our sources of water. And when we hear things about critical minerals coming into the press, so we may end up going there. But Vanessa, over to you. We have lots of people logging in. This is meant to be a conversation. There's a Q&A button. Don't wait until the end. If you have a question, jump in. Vanessa and I are gonna throw you into the mix, and we have an hour to make a little bit of sense of this situation. Vanessa?
Kim, thank you so much. I am excited about all this. As you know, there have been a flurry of executive orders. Every morning, it seems like it's a new journey, and there are clearly some fundamental shifts in the way the United States is doing business. So I am so thrilled that we have a cross-border trade law task force headed up by Martin and Stéphane to help our clients and help all of our colleagues at the CVCA think about how we're navigating these. As we noted, this is going to be a question and answer on the current state of play for how U.S. trade tariffs might affect your investment portfolio, or might affect the way you're thinking about investments. And again, with an apology, given the current dynamics, some of this webinar may well be outdated if you're watching a recording. So thank you all for joining now, and a special shout out to those joining on the live stream. As I've noted, and as Kim has mentioned, my colleague Martin is in our Ottawa office, and he's got almost, happily or sadly, Martin, 30 years of experience in government regulatory matters, with, of course, a key focus on trade treaty compliance. He's also, and this is an interesting part of the conversation later, he has represented clients in anti-dumping, subsidy, and tariff matters before various tribunals. So I'd like to touch on that a little bit at the end if we have some time. And of course, my terrific colleague Stéphane is literally in the eye of the executive order hurricane. He has 2 decades, so we got 50 years of trade between us here, of government and private practice experience in both national security and international trade, including most importantly for our conversation, U.S. export sanctions and customs relations. We sort of have an arc of three topics today. First of all, just the state of play today, current trade relations and recent U.S. tariff policies. We'd like to talk about some of the tariff structures and the implications for portfolios. And of course, the all-important conversation at the end, what are we thinking about strategies for that? And as Kim has pointed out, absolutely please ask questions through. We'll try to monitor the chat as we go. And let's start with Stefan. Stefan, every day it's a new journey. Every day I wake up, I think, what is going to go on in the news? Just so we can level set, where are we on February 13th at 12:08 p.m.?
Yep. No, it's been some exciting times. Very happy to be here speaking to everyone. I've obviously been kind of getting hoarse talking about a lot of these topics and helping clients try and navigate them. Where are we as of today is still very much in a state of flux. I think everyone will have known that back in February, supposed to be effective February 3rd, there were these universal tariffs imposed on all imports from Canada into the United States. And let me be a little more specific because the tariffs were oriented at products of Canada. So items that are manufactured or substantially transformed in Canada were going to be subject to a 25% tariff, with the exception of energy products and crude oil, refined petroleum, natural gas. Those are going to be subject to a 10% tariff across the board with no exceptions. There was not going to be an exclusion process. There was not going to be drawback, and they even had removed the de minimis exception. As everyone I hope knows, those tariffs have been suspended, for 30 days, so till the end of the month. And there's at least some hope that they will never go into effect, but that's yet to be seen. In addition to that, there was quite recently now announced an expansion of the existing what's called Section 232, or national security tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum products. And this is, once again, not targeted at any particular country. This is global, but it does include Canada. So Canada used to have an exemption. These were imposed originally back in 2018. But under the new order, Canada is no longer exempt. So there will be a 25% tariff imposed on raw steel and semi-processed steel and aluminum, as well as what they're calling, and what were called before, derivative products. And these are products that are manufactured from, the raw or semi-processed steel or aluminum that will be identified on a specific list. That list has not yet been published, so we can sort of only look to what was done historically. And historically, this applied to a relatively small universe of products that, like in the automotive industry, kind of small, and construction industries like steel tacks and that, things that have a predominant amount of value tied to the raw material inputs. So we're going to be quite interested to see exactly what that list is comprised of. And these tariffs aren't set to be imposed until March 12th. So there's a little bit of a reprieve before they go into effect. And so that will have a fairly large impact on the Canadian steel and aluminum markets, which export a fair amount to the U.S. And then today, cutting kind of right up to the wire at 1 o'clock. So at the end of this presentation, President Trump is expected to have a news conference where he announces reciprocal tariffs, as they've been called. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what those will entail. And it's actually uncertain if he will announce tariffs that are actually being implemented as of today, or if he's going to announce investigations into likely future tariffs. But the idea is he wants to impose tariffs that are reciprocal in nature to what U.S. goods are being taxed at in various foreign countries. This will not have as big an impact on Canada in all likelihood, although I think the average sort of tax on U.S. goods is around 3% in Canada. So Canada could be implicated, but it'll have a bigger impact on some of the more developing countries like India, that has about a 17% VAT tax, and they're equating VAT taxes to import tariffs. So we'll have to see what that entails, but it could impact goods that are flowing through Canada into the United States that are manufactured in those countries. So it's going to be relevant to a lot of people on this call as well. And that's it in a very short nutshell. There's a lot more detail that I could go into, but let me pause there.
Stefan, you have said a mouthful. One question has quickly come through, and maybe this is a nice sort of segue in a way, and I know, Kim, you have some questions from Martin as well, but in the chat, a colleague says, one of our Portco US brokers was recently notified by US CBP that they're reviewing the Portco's USMCA status. It's the first time the CEO has encountered this after years of shipping to the US. Can you comment on whether this is a widespread change in practice by the new administration? In other words, I think just investigating appropriate status under the US MCA.
Yeah, I think it's certainly been our experience and even an announced policy to step up enforcement. So, a lot of the enforcement is going to be focused on these new executive orders, but any sort of claims of privileged status under the USMCA, I think, is also open for re-examination, as are claims of origin and valuation. There's, I think, going to be a more aggressive approach. I don't know if that particular issue is part of the more aggressive approach or just that those issues were periodically being evaluated anyway. But I do think we can understand that there's a more aggressive approach being taken.
Martin, from your perspective, what are you hearing from your clients in reaction to this? And in your sense, like we were about to go renegotiate USMCA. What are you hearing from your clients? And when you're done answering that, give me a sense of, do you think this is a positioning to renegotiate faster and quicker, the USMCA, or you think, no, this has something to do with the, an imposition of tariffs and reacting to taxes globally that is separate from the USMCA?
Well, let's start with the client reactions. I think the main client reaction is that they now have to pay attention to a lot of the detail that is involved when they are shipping to products to the US. I mean, we had basically, for most products, no customs duty applicable when stuff was going to the US or from the US. So I think because of that, though, there was still a legal obligation to file customs declarations accurately, to determine origin accurately, to do all of those types of things. I think, given that it was going to be $0 at the end of the day in terms of customs duties, I think that maybe there wasn't a lot of attention spent to determine whether or not, for example, a good that they were claiming to be Canadian origin was in fact Canadian origin, or whether or not, the value of the product as it was being reflected on their invoices was the true custom valuation of that product. So those are ways not to avoid the customs tariff, but there's ways that you can look at those items and maybe get a sense of whether or not your current practices were adequate and gave you an accurate reflection of what tariffs would be paid on, what the value of the goods that you were sending to the US, and whether or not they were in fact goods that would be caught by these new tariffs. So that's part of it. So people are starting to look at whether or not their current practices in terms of how they ship stuff to the US is actually accurate. The other thing is, just the general uncertainty. I think a lot of clients are a bit concerned about, the pause is nice, but is on the overall tariffs, but what's going to happen in March. The uncertainty in and of itself creates problems, and so a lot of the questions that arise in relation to existing supply agreements or future ones, where to source products. In some cases, investments and M&As, just wondering on the impact of these tariffs. And at current, we can only reflect what has actually been passed. And some of that is coming, as Stefan mentioned, in relation to some of it is paused, some of it has been announced, but not some of the relevant schedules haven't been released. So that uncertainty makes it difficult to plan. And then the other thinking is, is this a new world order, or is this part, as you mentioned, just sort of a gambit that will be short-lived? Are we in an era of less liberalized trade, more tariffs, more protectionism, or is this just sort of a negotiation strategy to exact concessions from Canada and other countries? And I think the answer to that is a bit of both. I think for sure that the Trump administration has indicated that tariffs are a method of revenue generation. So regardless of what you read about fentanyl, borders, national security, there's always going to be an underlying rationale for this. That is, the government, this current administration, sees tariffs as a way of generating revenue. Now, they're saying that it's revenue generated from foreign producers. In actual fact, importers pay that tax. Now, those importers they're not all US based. There are, foreign based importers who pay their own taxes. They import their own products and then distribute them afterwards. So they would pay that import tax. But at the end of the day, it's someone in the US or someone who's been granted special status to be an importer in the US who pays those tariffs. But I think on the second question, I think there is an element of this that's aimed at negotiating some other trade irritants that the US has and other issues. Those could be in relation to the current text of the CUSMA, of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, or they could be attempts to bring those issues into a broader trade negotiation, like the digital services tax. Are they going to bring that in? Ownership restrictions on financial institutions, that was floated as sort of a rationale. So those issues, some of them have a nexus in the free trade agreement. Some of them are new issues, but I think that there is some of this is to position that talk. And so there is a stipulated period, I think in about 18 months, when there has to be a negotiation, but the parties can negotiate, and that may be at the insistence of Canada and Mexico as much as the US, to say, hey, let's just deal with this all at once. What is the real issue here? And let's deal with it. Those haven't been commenced, and there's no indication that they will, but I can see the benefit of having a universal solution and some certainty from the Canadian and Mexican perspective, as well as the US perspective, where they're trying to use it in that process to get rid of some longstanding trade irritants.
Great answer.
Well, I have to confess, I'm digesting a lot here. Thank you guys so much. I wonder if we could drill down a little on this. Martin, you spoke a little bit about the digital services tax. You've spoken about other, and we touched on a couple of other sectors, specifically manufacturing and oil and gas. As we know, the CBCA membership have a number of different investment strategies that really vary across sectors. Key sectors for private equity, according to Kim and her fabulous team, because I read all your reports, thank you, include, industrial and manufacturing, which we've already touched on, oil and gas, which we've already touched on, but technology, life sciences, consumer retail, agroforestry, et cetera. Stefan, I wonder if you can start us off and let us know sort of the state of play in some of those more specific sectors. Acknowledging, though, that some of these seem to be quite blanket tariffs and maybe it doesn't get that sector specific. But over to you. I'm interested in your more specific insights on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really what that question gets to, given the sort of global nature of the tariffs, is what's outside the scope of the tariffs. And there really are some important sectors that are not impacted. The tariffs that are being imposed, particularly, those sort of global 25% tariffs on Canadian products, are really focused on products of Canadian origin that are being imported through the U.S. customs, sort of process. And these are tangible goods, really what this is getting at. There's been a long time exclusion for certain intangible products, like, for one thing, services are not subject to the tariffs. So, the service industry should not be impacted in the same way. But also intangible goods such as electronic transmissions of software or technology. Those have been under various agreements exempt from traditional customs imports and customs duties and tariffs for quite a number of years, and would take particular action by the president to target. And those are not currently included in any of the orders that we've seen. That's not to say they couldn't be targeted in future orders, but as of now, those exemptions remain. So like the high-tech industry, to the extent we're talking about, again, those electronic transmissions of software should not be impacted. And I don't know if anyone's still sending software by CD-ROM or something. I don't think they are, but those could be potentially captured. But thankfully, these electronic transmissions are not included. Electricity is another one that's been deemed intangible and not something that's imported through customs. So, electricity as of now should also be exempt from the tariffs. So, the electrical industry is probably at least thankful for the time being. Again, that could be changed. And then, importantly, non-Canadian origin products, even if they're being imported through Canada, are not subject to the Canadian specific tariffs. And so a lot of industry is looking at or reevaluating origin and supply chains, because there's opportunities there to perhaps mitigate or avoid the tariffs, depending on where your goods are processed and where you're getting the components from. So there are some important carve-outs, but for like the retail industry, for a lot of years, people, there was a shift, particularly from China, but also from Canada and other countries, to start making use of this de minimis exception, which allowed shipments under $800 to be shipped duty and tariff free. And so a lot of those retail companies started shipping direct to end customers rather than bulk shipments. And that way they could avoid the tariffs. But now, under these new orders, that de minimis exception doesn't apply. So retail companies that are selling out of Canada into the U.S. no longer are able to avoid tariffs in that manner. So they'll have to adjust.
That's a big adjustment.
Yeah.
And we had some portfolio companies that are VC backed signaled that this 25% was basically like they weren't even profitable now. So like that pressure on these portfolios is really high. So Vanessa, if you allow me, I'd like to ask Martin, like when you think about that kind of pressure on companies, and like I in speaking to all our members, like I'm saying, what are you guys thinking? What are you doing? And they're saying, okay, it's case by case. We're going into our portfolio companies. We're doing an assessment. Okay, what is the business model? How are you impacted? When you think about our members talking to their portfolio companies, do you have any other advice that is actually trade law, like things that they may not even be thinking about because they're just thinking about like the flow of business and things that they should, have on a checklist of things to think about when it comes to the movement of these goods? And you're on mute, just so you know. before you get going. Good old mute.
Yeah, I think one of the things that one of the things to remember is that tariffs aren't the only mechanisms to impact. Well, first of all, we haven't really talked about the potential implication of what Canada can do as countermeasures. I mean, that's one thing I think but that Canada announced in anticipation of the Canada-Mexico tariffs that were contemplated for early February. They had already set out a list of products that would be subject to reciprocal or retaliatory tariffs, so products of the US coming into Canada. There was about products representing about $30 billion worth of imports that were targeted in the first tranche, and then the remaining 125 billion was going to be released after later in the month, after a period of consultation with Canadian businesses. So yeah, your flow of stuff going to the US is going to be a problem, going to be an issue, but you have to be cognizant that if your supply chain involves imports from the US, there's a potential that those reciprocal trade actions could impact on that. In addition to that, I mean, you still have to comply with sanctions laws and export controls. You still need to make sure that there's still anti-dumping actions. Like, as far as I know, even if a 25% tariff is imposed in relation to, let's say, Canadian lumber, it doesn't prevent the US lumber industry to continue seeking anti-dumping measures as against the Canadian softwood lumber, for example. I mean, there's those.
Let's double click on that, because if you had a 25% tariff on lumber, would they still feel like there's dumping given the price difference?
Well, I mean, they would probably wait to see whether or not there was still a case for dumping based on the imposition of tariffs. You're right that may be a change in circumstances that might impact whether or not they can still say there's dumping. But at the end of the day, it depends on the landed price in the US. And if they still feel that there's a delta because of the way Canadian lumber rights are accorded, it's a long history in the US. I'm using lumber as an example, but it doesn't mean that those are the only trade issues. And plus, as I think the other thing to remember, as Stefan said, is when you impose these measures, whether they're they're imposed by Canada reciprocally or whether or not they're imposed by the US initially, there's going to be heightened enforcement. So the way that you fill out your customs declarations, the way that you if it's an intra-company transfer, if you've got, evaluation in relation to that, those are all things that are going to be, there's going to be more people, more staffing on border issues and on trade issues on both sides of the border. So there's going to be additional scrutiny, as Stefan said, when new measures come out. There's just generally heightened in enforcement at the borders, and when that happens, you just have to be careful in the way that you do some of the nuts and bolts, easy stuff that your customs broker usually do. But those are the types of things that you have to be careful about.
Okay, when I hear all of that, the only thing I can think about is costs and lack of productivity and delays. Stefan, from your perspective, like sitting where you're at in the US, like the US, even like the swearing in of the new housing secretary in the US, like they kept probing him on, you said you're going to reduce the cost of building, but with these tariffs would increase the cost of building everything. What do you say to that? And he kept saying, well, the president it's his own prerogative. But it, like, do you feel like or maybe the question is the impact on the US and how long it will be felt once, and I want to talk after about like the delay in Canada saying anything, like Martin, you had a list of, but for an average person, they don't really know what Ottawa is thinking of doing in terms of retaliation. But let's first talk about, like, from the US perspective, how long this will be felt, what the impact is from where you sit.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's what the administration is sort of selling the American public on, and then there's the real practical impact. I mean, there's been an acknowledgement that there will be some pain, but that, you know, that it's being sold, like Martin said earlier, as something that the countries that are being tariffed are paying. And it's not really being explained how these costs are ultimately sort of divided. I mean, there is some truth to the fact that you know, the suppliers that are sending these goods do end up absorbing some of the cost of the tariff. You know, the importer of record pays the tariffs at entry, but usually, you know, we get involved in negotiating the risk allocation, and suppliers end up, to remain competitive, absorbing some of these costs. But a portion of them, you know, sometimes it varies, but a portion does get passed on to the consumer. And I think what you're suggesting has not been widely understood by the American public, that their prices for buying all these goods ultimately will rise. And there's been some reports that the average consumer will spend $1,500 more a year on common items that they purchase. And whether these measures will have the longevity after people start reacting to these increased costs is open for debate. But right now, there's a sort of a lot of support for this. You know, people buy into the fact that there's been some unfairness and, you know, lack of balance, and like, why shouldn't we get our, you know, our money back, if you will, you know, to compensate for that. And there's not been a lot of resistance in Congress, that's for sure.
And we have a question from Paul in the audience that's asking about the possibility, and I would even add feasibility, of applying tariffs to services. Asking, since services are primary output of VC-backed startup companies. Possibility, feasibility.
Yeah, well, anything is possible. I mean, the either Congress or the Congress has delegated to the president wide authority to regulate or impose duties or tariffs on any sort of tangible or intangible goods that cross the border. But our system has not been designed to do that. And there would have to be some real structural changes to try and impose a tariff. How do you even, you know, sort of kind of account for it? And how do you track it, and how do you declare it? I have not heard any whispers of that. So I think that if it's going to happen is farther down the road, because it would really take not just an executive order, but some, you know, actual kind of infrastructure to be able to implement tariffs of that nature. And there's other agreements. I mean, not that we were paying attention to all the WTO and other multilateral agreements that we're party to, but, you know, there's been long-standing sort of under acceptance and agreement that services will not be taxed in that manner. So I think it unlikely, but it's possible.
I think that's a fair point. Anything is possible at this stage. So to your point, lots of scenario planning, I think, going on. I think that's a message I'm hearing. And Martin, just apropos of scenario planning, you know, in conversations with our clients, and Stefan, I'm opening the question to you as well. But Martin, what are you hearing our clients doing? What I've heard from you say so far is people are getting quite granular about what's in their products, country of origin, value, et cetera. And it's a much more detailed conversation than maybe it used to be. But what other things are you seeing? You and I talked a little bit about east-west flows, for example. Martin, interested in the adaptation you're seeing from a practical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that I've seen is, you know, sometimes with free trade currently, you know, there's a lot of incentive to move production sort of north-south where it makes sense. So if you've got a plant in Mississauga, you might be, you know, sending product you know, assuming there's no other, you know, regulatory restrictions on moving that product, but you could target, you know, the Great Lakes area, for example, and that would include, you know, a lot of Great Lakes states, Michigan, you know, Wisconsin, other states in that area. And then maybe you'd have a plant in, you know, Western US that would service that area and Western Canada. Now, if we're looking at tariffs imposed by the US on flows southbound and particular potential reciprocal tariffs, going from the US into Canada, there's more thinking about strategically just having Canadian production satisfy Canadian demand, looking into the added transportation costs and seeing whether or not that calculus makes sense. And similarly, if there's a plant in the US, maybe that plant is selling, you know, more into the US and servicing more and having that. So what was kind of a borderless decision in the past is now becoming impacted by the border. So reallocating production, figuring supply chains based a bit more on geographic borders are some of the reactions. I just want to go back to the services question, though, if I can quickly. I think the important thing to remember that in addition to the issue that, you know, there's some structural issues that would need to happen both in Canada and the US. There's two things to remember. A, there might be some measures that are undertaken that still impact services going south, short of, you know, imposition of tariffs. And one is to restrict access to government contracts more. So there, you know, and in that case, that would be sort of a reaction to what Canada is already thinking of doing, right? So Canada is the one who's talking about restricting US service providers to provincial contracts. So, you know, so we'd be firing the first shot, if you will. So that's one way to impact. It's not a tariff. The second thing is, if you're looking at the overall motivation and how this is being sold in the US, it's that, you know, we've got trade deficits with these countries on products. And, you know, we want to remedy that. And, you know, we've got excess capacity in the US and, you know, yet we're allowing these plants in Canada to sell into the US when they're at higher you know, they're higher utilization. Services goes the other way. I mean, the US has a services surplus in relation to Canada and the rest of the world. So I don't see the motivation in them opening a can of worms and starting a process where tariffs are starting to be imposed on services. I mean, if you think of the largest service providers in the world, whether they're consulting, accounting, or whatever, they tend to have a US nexus. So if you're going to start opening that can of worms, it becomes a bit dangerous for the US because they're no longer in a position where they can say, well, yeah, we're in a deficit position. They're actually in a huge surplus. So I don't see them doing it. But like I said, there's other things that can happen that can disrupt flows of services to the US. But the tariffs seem certainly not immediate and a bit of a stretch right now.
So Martin, you touched for a minute there on like what Ottawa is musing about and the different approaches that they can take. And I'd like us to spend a couple minutes on what's happening in Ottawa. Like there's a lot of people in the tech ecosystem and our membership that have signed letters calling on the House to return and like the need for government to be really active. But having worked in government, having been there and understanding like the capabilities of our ambassador in the US and some of our trade negotiator, and give us a sense of what you're seeing and feeling. I know you're not in the room, but you've been part of this ecosystem for a while. How, like, explain to the people that are listening, like, how does this work? Like, how do people come to decide what's going to be on the list, where the lists come from, like the process of thinking about a reaction from Canada to what we're facing in terms of headwinds?
Well, we can only, I mean, we can see what happened in the past. So in relation to the across the board tariffs that were mentioned in February, what was a bit surprising is that they came out with a list of, an initial list of $30 billion worth of or goods that represent $30 billion worth of annual trade immediately and without consultation. And so that is a departure. Typically, what would happen is you'd have a 21-day consultation. At this point, also, I think fair to say that there's been some outreach by all levels of government, provincial and federal, to speak to stakeholders to figure out, the Canadian government is not really interested in imposing tariffs on goods from the US that are going to harm production in Canada or companies in Canada that, for example, are using those inputs to ship goods abroad, or that really need them as part of their value chain. It's not designed really to hurt Canadian business. Now, that being said, there's got to be some products. There will be products, and not everyone's going to be happy about that. And if you're an importer of products from the US, they're targeted. There could be some pain there in terms of additional tariffs, but generally they would have a 21-day period in which they would want to hear from stakeholders. They may set up some meetings, or probably meetings already taking place, to try to figure out what that is. But your main argument there is not, well, this is going to hurt me specifically, but more that, this is going to affect jobs in Canada. This is going to affect voters in Canada. This is going to affect pricing to consumers in Canada on critical consumer products. Those are the types of arguments that tend to resonate. So I think that was contemplated for the bulk, the $125 million worth of retaliatory tariffs that were going to come had the pause not happened on the across the board tariffs. So far, in terms of the steel and aluminum products, there's not been a lot of, it's a little unclear what the government will be doing in relation to those. In the past, there were retaliatory tariffs imposed in Canada when, in 2018, the government, the US, imposed similar tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. At that time, there was a consultation, so I expect that there will be a consultation in this instance, and this is the opportunity of people on the line or Canadian businesses to impact that. So I would expect that would be the process going forward on all of these tariff measures. And then there has been some talk about Canada itself imposing restrictions on the flow of goods to the United States. Again, I would expect that before they did that, and that was what they hinted at when they were contemplating those measures, that I think those will be more long-term. There will be consultation with industry and an ability for industry to speak to that. So that was, imposing maybe restrictions on oil and gas flows to the US or critical minerals flows to the US. It wasn't specified. It was just, they kind of had a note in their press releases saying that, they keep saying everything's on the table, and they mentioned such further other countermeasures that we may contemplate. So it wasn't clearly defined, but I think that would be something that there will be a process about, and that stakeholders will be consulted.
I know we've gone around this one time with the previous Trump administration, but this feels like uncharted territory. And like, having been in the department, having been in the minister's office, like in the past, you always had time. Like there was kind of a schedule that you were following, and there was kind of a cadence to that dance. From where I'm sitting, I feel like if I was in those shoes today and I was sitting at 125 Sussex, we don't have the luxury of these long consultations. Like, we may want to put things out there and see how people react. And if it's really bad, then we pull back or we adjust as we go. But that will be something that we have to wait and see. Stéphane, do you want to add anything to what Martin just said?
No, I mean, I think I agree to a large extent with everything he said. I mean, I mean, what is different this time around, and I think maybe impacting some of these consultation periods on the Canadian side is for the first time, President Trump, and he threatened to do this in his first administration, but didn't, is using his emergency powers to impose some of these tariffs. And so those tariffs that he announced on Canada, under his traditional tariff authority, would usually have required an investigation period and then a rulemaking process. So people would have months to sort of think about it and see what's coming. Whereas this time, under his emergency power, which has never really been used by an American president other than Nixon in 1971, under a different statute. But he can impose the tariffs almost overnight. And that's what happened here. I mean, he announced it, a couple days before they were set to become effective. And I think that changes the dynamic a little bit on how Canada responds when there's such a short period.
When it comes to trade law, like we have obligations, right? They have obligations, we have obligations, we've signed treaties. Like, is most of that kind of mute given the politics? Like people are just gonna move ahead and like not really follow the fine print of what was agreed to? Or is there still, you think, from the bureaucracies, like a sense of like, no, these obligations are important?
Well, that is notable with the emergency powers because, even the USMCA or CUSMA, depending on where you are, does have carve-outs to allow each country to follow through on national emergency matters. So technically, I mean, you can argue, and I'm sure it'll be disputed, but it at least sort of follows the color of what those obligations were. The WTO is a different matter. But I think the U.S. is blocking the people that would vote at the WTO from taking those positions. So there's really no one there right now to, China's tried to take this to the WTO, for example, but there's no way to resolve things through that mechanism. So I don't know. They're at least following the color of what was agreed to, I think, depending on how narrow or broadly you view those. I don't know if Martin, you have other feelings on that from your side.
Yeah, emergency national security. I think looking to trade agreements becomes difficult. I think both parties now are in a zone where they're not really contemplating, what they're bound by, but because even Canada in the reciprocal tariffs are calling it a national security reaction. So everyone's using national security. And I think just a point of distinction. So that's true. And then secondly, at the end of the day, really the main mechanism or the main sort of hammer that you have in all of these agreements is that you can impose reciprocal tariffs, which Canada is doing anyway. So, if they can go through the USMCA, get a ruling, and then impose reciprocal tariffs, or they can use the same language that the US is using and call this a national security issue or national emergency. I think where there's more interesting questions is whether the invocation of the IEPA in the US is legal, under US domestic law, whether or not that's being followed carefully. And I can't speak to it, but if there's going to be a legal challenge to this, I would imagine it would be in the US courts and not necessarily under some sort of dispute mechanism under the USMCA. And one small thing in terms of the interaction between the ability to impact the scope of these, Stéphane mentioned it earlier, but on the steel and aluminum tariffs, what is interesting is that in the past, US importers could argue that there should be exclusions from those, saying, this type of steel we don't make in the US, so it should be excluded from the funding so that you can have an exclusion. And I think there were like hundreds of exclusion requests and some were granted. Now, some of those still exist and they'll be allowed to expire, but pretty much it was very clear in the executive order that any new types of exclusion requests that would be made in the US in relation to that funding, there would be no mechanism for that, no exclusions, just the existing ones, which are going to expire sometime in the next 12 months will be allowed to run, but there wouldn't be any new exclusions. So that mechanism of kind of trying to impact the process is also, you know, a change, is that that's no longer going to be available, at least in relation to the steel and aluminum tariffs.
Well, questions are now starting to come in. We've got a couple here. I'd like to start with the national security question, but Paul, thank you. You've asked the question that we were going to ask at the end, which is what advice should Canadian VCs be providing to their portfolio companies? But Adriana has a great question on national security. I'm just going to read it. The Biden administration did impose some restrictions on outward investment on this basis to certain countries. Would you expect this national security argument to expand more broadly to restrict capital into other jurisdictions and nationalities? Stefan, I think that might be to you. And then, of course, we'll round out the conversation with let's get to the practical advice.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, the kind of the focus of that whole outbound investment regime right now is, of course, on investment into China, which is perceived as a global competitor, and depending on how you look at it, you know, in some circles, you know, an unfriendly nation to the U.S. I think, you know, there is some thought to expanding that outside of, you know, just China to other kind of sensitive adversary countries, if you will. But I don't know that there's like discussion on imposing those types of restrictions very broadly. You know, certainly not like, you know, these tariffs are being discussed. And I wouldn't think there would be any sort of concept of outbound investment restrictions to Canada or, you know, other allied nations. At least I'd like to think not. That isn't the way it's structured or intended as of now.
Well, thank you. That's a ray of hope. Thank you for that. But of course, the final real question, and then of course I'll let Kim finish it off, is what is the practical advice that Canadian private equity and venture capital should be providing to their portfolio companies, and both over the short term and the longer term? Stefan, maybe you want to start with that, and Martin can finish off with Kim.
Yeah, well, I can talk about that certainly from the U.S. perspective. And, you know, to me, a lot of these issues, you know, we have clients that, of course, are in Southeast Asia and other places in the world that have been dealing with these tariff issues for a long time. And it's striking to me how Canada is sort of now waking up to issues that a lot of the other rest of the world have already been dealing with. I mean, in the short term, there's some very just like simple practical advice, and a lot of people are doing this. You know, get your goods in as quickly as you can and try and get them in before the tariffs are imposed. I mean, that's a very simple piece of advice that people are following. You know, and also, and I've seen this repeatedly now, and Martin touched on this, you know, Canadian companies hadn't really focused on, you know, they did the import paperwork, but they hadn't focused on what things like origin and valuation and, you know, avenues that they might have to mitigate tariff risk, because it didn't matter. And so it's extremely important, you know, to go back and look at those things and say, are my products even subject to these? Like maybe we've misclassified the origin, or, you know, on the valuation side, you know, just for simplicity, a lot of importers have grouped, you know, not only the price of the product, but aftermarket services into their valuation that they're declaring, because it, again, didn't matter. And now, you know, aftermarket services and warranty and things like that may be able to be excluded. So there's a scramble right now to go back and look at these practices. And, you know, if there's an argument, a well-grounded argument to change them, you know, that should be looked into. You know, those are easy short-term fixes. More kind of medium term is start looking at supply chains. You know, this has become quite well developed in Southeast Asia, where companies have developed U.S. supply chains for the U.S. market, and then rest of the world supply chains. And that's an avenue to, again, kind of try and avoid some of these tariffs. Now, if global tariffs are imposed, you know, that will be of limited utility, but it's still something very practical that could be done more in the midterm. I mean, longer term, you start looking at moving your entire supply chain, moving your manufacturing facilities, which cost billions of dollars and take years. I mean, there's a right or wrong. I think there's a current belief that these tariffs may not last beyond this administration. So I have not seen like a lot of new sort of movement towards moving, giant infrastructure, because that takes a longer term commitment. But companies that were already eyeing opening manufacturing facilities in the U.S., that this is just one more little added kind of shove to go down that road. Because once you're manufacturing here, you're going to avoid a lot of these issues. And I see we only have a few minutes. I could go on more. I mean, the other thing, I'll just say it very quickly, is just negotiating contract terms. Number one, see what your existing terms are. I've noticed that a lot of Canadian companies did not negotiate particularly favorable, terms for the, or at least on the side of the U.S., the purchaser. But you can negotiate risk allocation and mitigate some of the harm through contracts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Martin for his perspective.
Yeah, not much to add. That's, the contract piece is important. I think also just if you're looking at your portfolio, you need to assess whether or not there's currently even a tariff risk at all in relation to what you do. And a lot of that has to do with what sector you're in, what are you selling? As we mentioned, some things, some intangible goods aren't subject. So if that's your business, then for now, you're fine. Keep an eye out because it's a changing world. But, I think you can only deal with what you have. I think that generally, look, I can't predict the future, but I think that we've had, a good run of trade liberalization. This seems to be a blip. Whether or not it's going to be, it's not going to be a 12-month blip, but it may not be the sea change that everyone is anticipating. A lot will depend on how the rest of the world reacts and whether or not we're all going to entrench ourselves in protectionist measures or not. So we'll wait and see what happens in relation to that. But a lot of longer term decisions really depend on whether or not this is a new world order or just an administration specific thing. So I think I think I would hold off determining certainly that this is going to be a 10-year or 20-year trend that's going to continue.
Well, hard to believe we're shy of a month into all of this. Like, it feels like it's lasted a lot longer. So as Vanessa and I talked about, like, maybe we'll have to do this again. We didn't talk about like Delaware corp. We didn't talk about dollars. There's so many other things that our members are thinking about, and like the advantage of a low dollar, the disadvantage of a low dollar, the movement of talent. In the first administration, N1, H1B visas were being declined. These people were coming to Canada. Are we in a different frame of mind, even politically there? So there's so many things that we did not touch on today. So we may do this again. We're going to take the pulse from our members. To those of you who joined today, thank you. To those of you who were live streaming, thank you. Many of you will get this into your inbox, as Vanessa said. It is mailed to everyone who's registered. So if you thought this was useful, pass it along to a colleague. To the team at Norton Rose Fulbright, thank you so much, Stefan. Martin, nice to see you again, and thank you for taking the time. And Vanessa, thank you so much for partnering with me time and time again, for your energy and for orchestrating this wonderful conversation that a lot of value to our members who are navigating uncharted waters. So with that, we'll see you in a couple of weeks for one of the second to last, I think, of IC24. And IC25 is open and for our members right now. So if you're intending on being there and you want to save a few dollars, we have an early bird special. And if not, you have a number of weeks to make your plans to see us in Calgary at the end of May. With that, I'm going to thank everyone and wish you a good, long, snowy, long weekend, a family day, at least in Ontario. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.